All right, now that we've watched that video and answered those questions, I want to read this verse for you, and you can fill in the blanks as I read. In Romans 4:7-8, it says, "Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account." And so, with the topic of garden coverings, I really want us to focus on what we mean when we're talking about sins being covered. Because, as we saw in the video, there was something that Adam and Eve tried to do to cover their sin. And then we're going to see why that method was limited and why it was not going to be able to cover their sin ultimately. And then we see how Jesus comes into the picture, right? So as we saw in the video, Adam and Eve tried to use leaves as a way to hide their sin and shame from God. They thought, okay, after eating the forbidden fruit, now I do have that knowledge of good and evil, and I recognize my sin, and I want to hide that. And so they thought they had the power to control how God saw them, using something from the earth. Now, in the video, we also saw that as a result of that sin, the ground was cursed, and that meaning pretty much everything of the world, the plants and everything that comes from the earth was cursed. And so I want us to use that as an idea because we're going to be thinking about how using something that is imperfect is ultimately limited and how we even try to do that in our own lives in one way or another. So I want you to think of it like this. We think of the fact that everything on earth will rot after a period of time. And I want you to think that in the way we're viewed in God's eyes, the fact that we sin is something that happens continually. It happens every day. And so anything we use to cover our sin will fade away, and our sinful nature will be exposed again because that's just who we are. And that's why I like this picture to show that there's the leaves that we use to cover up when we try to deceive God or deceive even ourselves. And then how eventually that becomes exposed and we try to cover up again. But that never ultimately is the solution to being able to cover our sins. Okay, so with that said, I want to translate it to how the garden coverings relate to us today. And so I think in a similar way that Adam and Eve tried to do it, one way we try to cover our guilt and shame, and just look at the example with Adam and Eve. Sometimes there can be lying, we can blame others, we can make excuses, we can get angry and lash out, or we can just be prideful and not want to take responsibility. And so those are ways that we try to cover the guilt that we have because we know we feel it in our hearts, but we still try to hide that, right? And then, but a funny thing is also when we think of our relationship with God and even our relationship with people, we also try to earn God's love by thinking that there's things we can do to make him love us more. And so things like being nice to others, being honest, not stealing, reading the Bible, going to church. While these are great things, sometimes we tend to think that by doing those things, those are the coverings that allows God to ultimately forgive us of our sin, as if that's the complete way we are forgiven. Okay? And so if we look further, now the critical question is, does God know how we really feel? Because he understands the nature of why we try to do these things, why we cover up our sin, because he knows us, he created us in his image. And so I think the thing that I want us to take away is the fact that, number one, we're fully known by God. He knows our hearts. He knows that we want to please him, even though we're sinful, as Adam and Eve did. And despite that, we're fully loved by him. And so that's why I say think about it as having a best friend or even a parent who's always going to love you despite your actions. And so because of that, we can realize that we can take an exhale because we know that no matter what, we are loved.